our first foray into C# programming with the MonoDevelop tool. I'm running MonoDevelop on a Mac, but you can run it on a PC. You can even run it on Linux, so that won't help you with Unity because Unity isn't run on Linux. But the tool exists in all three environments, and it is ostensibly the same in all three environments. This particular copy of MonoDevelop that I'm running right now, you can see has the little Unity cube on it. This is the exact one that is bundled with the current version of Unity, which I'm not sure what I think it's 4.2 point something. It's 4 point something. And it's the one that we're using in the course. So this is the same one that we use for Unity. I wanted to point out that if you go to monodevelop.com, it gets a little bit confusing. Let me bring this down so we can see it. The latest version of MonoDevelop, if you were to go to download it, MonoDevelop is a standalone program. It usually doesn't. It exists outside of Unity is what I'm trying to say. You could have downloaded MonoDevelop and been working in MonoDevelop for years without even knowing that Unity exists. As it happens, the Unity program is written in C# and was originally developed in MonoDevelop, and so this is the tool that they actually use to make Unity. So it stands to reason that that's probably the best choice for a script editor, using the tool that the tool is actually written in. If you go and look at the current stable release, you can download it for Windows or Mac, and when I click on Mac, it doesn't matter which one you pick, you're going to get the same thing, just obviously for the different version. You're going to see something called Xamarin Studio. That's the new version of MonoDevelop. It's called Xamarin Studio now. They've changed it. There's a for-profit effort. MonoDevelop has traditionally been free, open source. Free as in you don't pay anything for it, and free as in open source. You can get the source code if you want to and change and do whatever you want to it, which is what the Unity folks have done. They've got MonoDevelop as a branch so that they don't change over to the Xamarin stuff. Xamarin Studio, if you go look at Xamarin, I think it's xamarin.com. They're basically taking the C# stuff into the mobile world. So this is the same tool. It's just rebranded. And it's got more of an influence in the app space, creating apps for phones and tablets. And traditionally that's been done with tools that are native to whichever platform you're on. So for example, if you were developing for the iPad, you would use Xcode. If you're developing for the Android, you would use Eclipse and the Android tools. What they would like to do with Xamarin is allow you to use C#, one language for everything, and one tool for everything. And that's what Xamarin Studio is and what it's become. We're still using MonoDevelop, which is, again, the same tool. It's just customized a little bit differently. So MonoDevelop, as I said, is just a general purpose IDE, integrated development environment for C#. It isn't specific to Unity, so there are things that you can do in MonoDevelop that don't have anything to do with Unity. And as it happens, that's where we're going to start. We're going to write our first few programs in C# outside of Unity so that you can see the mechanics of the language and see how things are put together. And then we'll go into Unity and start using it as a script editor. And then eventually we'll move into a realm where you are writing libraries that can be incorporated into Unity and doing it probably the most preferred way that most studios are going to be developing code. So let's start by creating a new solution. Everything is a solution. A solution can contain multiple projects, and there are a few of them here. And this is where you can tell that you're dealing with Unity because you've got Unity script as a possibility down here. Oddly enough, you have an ASP.NET and a Unit possibility. I'm not sure what those are about, but for the most part, this is what Unity is going to use. We're going to go up here to the top, and we're just going to use a regular console project. So what this would be is if you were writing a console application, i.e. one that you run from the command line of your operating system. It doesn't have a user interface. It's strictly just pure programming code. There are a few other possibilities in here. You can actually write desktop applications that will work on Windows, Linux, and the PC if you go via the GTK Sharp 2.0 project. So that's a possibility. And the other two are libraries, and we'll get into libraries a little bit later. That's more of the advanced features that I'll teach you later in the course. For now, let's stick with a console project, and I'm going to call this if I can get my keyboard lined up correctly. Dungeons and Dragons. So we're going to write a little exercise here based on the old Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax books, dice, staying up all night, fun that a lot of us had as kids, or at least I did. If you didn't, that's too bad. You'll get a bit of it here. Okay, so I'm going to click this. I've named it Dungeons and Dragons. It's putting it in users projects, or users Bruce Van Horn projects, which is a folder that I've set up for this stuff, and we're calling it Dungeons and Dragons. It's going to create a directory for the solution. So underneath users Bruce Van Horn projects, it's going to create a folder called Dungeons and Dragons, and that's where everything's going to live. I'm going to click OK, and it's going to create the solution area for me. So if we focus on this area over here, we can see our solution, and there are a number of things in it. When MonoDevelop created our solution, it went ahead and it created 2 code files for me, and it created a structure. So inside of this structure, we have the solution, we have the project. Remember, a solution can contain multiple projects. By default, they have the same name, but you can always change them if you want to. And then it creates 2 code files for me, one called main.cs and one called assemblyinfo.cs. Within main.cs, which is the file that we're looking at over here, let me make this a little bigger. Nope, that doesn't work. There we go. On the Mac, apparently I said there was no difference. Apparently it's Alt roller on your mouse wheel. I could have sworn in the PC version it was just the roller. But I can make that a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. Okay, so that's a little easier to see. Just in case you're coming into YouTube and it's unbelievably tiny, now we can see everything. Okay, so this is our main file. You can see up here there's a tab called main.cs, and that's the file that we're in. We can have multiple files open at the same time. I'll open assembly info so you can see it. Usually you don't mess with the stuff in here except for changing the version numbers of whatever you're working on. We'll do that another time. There are comments in here that will give you instructions on what to do. Okay, so let's go back over to main CS. They're just tabs. And we can get rid of this one by clicking the little X here and closing it. And now we can see that we're inside a class file. There are a couple of pieces to a class. This is what a typical class looks like. Starting with using system. So a using statement in C# is just like a package statement in Java, or maybe an import statement in C++. It tells the system that you're going to be using parts of the language that are not part of the C# core. In this case, you get system whether or not you need it. You may not even need it. There are a lot of cases where the system functionality just isn't used, but they put something up there every single time. If you look at Visual Studio, you get a lot more stuff up there by default. Again, irrespective of whether or not you need it, it puts things up there at the top for you. This is the most commonly used namespace, and so they put it up there at the top. Which is a nice segue into the next piece, namespace. A namespace is just a way of organizing code into usable little chunks, little packages. And I'm trying to choose my words carefully because if you were in Java, that's what it would say here. It would say package instead of namespace. There are a few differences if you're coming from Java. In Java, your package has to be named the same as your folder structure. That's not true in C#. You can do whatever you want with your namespace. You can call it anything and put it anywhere you want to. That's not necessarily a good idea. It's a good idea to follow the Java rules and put the namespace in the same folder structure. It's just easier to find things that way, but you don't have to. The other thing that you don't have to do in C# that you do have to do in Java, you have to limit your files to one class per file. In C# you don't have to do that. You can put as many classes as you want to within a single file. Again, I don't recommend it because what happens is your gigantic class file becomes bloated very quickly and it gets hard to navigate, find things. So generally you want to follow, if you're coming from Java, you want to follow the conventions of Java. They've worked really well for a really long time. And just because you have a little bit more freedom here doesn't necessarily mean that's a great thing to exercise all the time. Okay, so we've got the namespace, we've got using. Let's take a look at class. Everything in C# is a class. You can only do object-oriented programming in C#. You cannot do procedural or functional programming, and so everything is going to wind up being a class. There's another structure that you can use called struct, but we'll save that for another day. For now, let's just stick to class. So you have the class that you'll notice some of these words are blue. These are keywords that are unique to the language. So those are keywords, reserved words, whichever one you want to call them. These are things that are unique to C#. So this denotes that we're creating a class. The next piece is the name of the class, which in this case just comes in as a default main class. You could name this whatever you wanted to, but when it's created for me automatically, it was just called main class, which is fine with me. The next set is the main method. If you're doing a console application, you have to have a method. It has to be static, and it has to be called, generally has to be called main. That's more of a convention. So if you look at these different parts, there's a lot on this line. So let's kind of dissect it backwards. Main is a method. A method is a function it's basically used to do some sort of work or some sort of operation. In this case, the name of the method is main. That's what we're calling it. And you can tell it's a method because it has parentheses and some argument after it. We don't actually use this particular argument. You could actually take this out if you wanted to, and it looks more like a regular function here. So now we have main, the parentheses, and now it's starting to look more like a function from some other language. You've got curly braces, which denote the code block that makes up the function, or in this case, method. You've got some code within the method. So this is your standard hello world program that just prints the word hello line. Hello world text to your command line. Pretty simple. Let's go back to where we were a moment ago. I'm going to go ahead and put this back in so it is how it was. We've got the name of the function, the arguments for the function. Working backwards, we have the return type for the function. In this case, there isn't one, so we're going to stick with void. Prior to that, we have the word static. This is a special word in C#. This generally means that you've got a class that doesn't have to be instantiated in order to be used. We'll play with this. It'll make a lot more sense when you actually make a static class and use it as such. The only reason this is static is because it's a command line program and it has to be static. And then the last word in this little group here is public. So public is what's called an access modifier. This tells you how this function can be accessed. And it's got a nice little pop-up that tells you what that word means. We'll be doing a lot with access modifiers. It's part of a bigger concept called encapsulation. But for now, let's just see what this looks like when we run it. So we have this basic program skeleton already created for us. If we go up to the top and we click run, actually let's not do that. Let's do run start without debugging. That'll be a little faster. It will compile our program. You can see that the build was successful, and here's my console output. It'll say hello world, press any key to continue. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If I press continue, my command line process ends, and I'll close it. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward stuff. You'll notice there's very little up here across the top. So you can search your code. This is an area for system messages. They're basically copying Xcode here. Xcode has this same window on it, and it's just for informational messages. You have a run button, and you can choose which configuration you want. So there's debug configuration, and there's a release configuration. You can make your own configurations to do different things, but these are the two that come standard with any C# project. The difference between them is that debug adds a bunch of symbols into the compilation that allow you to debug it, and the release one omits those. So generally when you're going to release your code, you switch to release mode, and you don't generate those symbol files. This makes it a little harder for people to reverse engineer your code, although that's never really much of a concern in my book. It does, however, reduce the number of files that you have to distribute, and in general, it's supposed to make your program more performant if you're working in release mode. For the work that we do, it wouldn't really matter that much. If you're doing a web application, it's going to make a huge difference which one you pick. But you should still go ahead and stick with release when you're making the final release of your code. All right, so that's a pretty decent introduction to the basic parts. There's a few other basic parts that we'll look at, like properties. We'll come to those as we move on, but that's a really basic introduction to the MonoDevelop integrated development environment.